Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm Carolyn Best, Director of Arts and Letters Live here at the DMA. Welcome to our Artful Musings event featuring Pico Iyer. And just a few logistics to note before we start. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones. And after Pico's talk, he's happy to take questions from all of you, so feel free to raise your hand, and a staff member will bring a microphone to you. If possible, please stand up when posing your question, just so that Pico can see you easily and address you directly. After the event, we invite you to meet him at the book signing, which is in the concourse near the DMA store, where copies of Autumn Light and A Beginner's Guide to Japan are available for purchase, as well as a few other titles. I'd like to thank and acknowledge Arts and Letters Live's annual season supporters, the K. Catarula Endowment for the Literary and Performing Arts, and the McGee Foundation Arts and Letters Live Endowment Fund at the DMA. Major support is provided by the Hirsch Foundation. The Fairmont Hotel Dallas is the exclusive hotel partner for the 2019 Arts and Letters Live series, and promotional support is provided by KERA. I want to highlight a few upcoming events that I think will appeal to this audience. On Thursday, October 24th, we'll present John Grisham at the Eisman Center. His latest legal thriller, The Guardians, was just released yesterday and explores the theme of wrongful convictions. Then on November 11th, don't miss National Book Award-winning novelist Tim O'Brien in conversation with author Ben Fountain. O'Brien will share insights about his latest book in nearly 2 decades. He realized that after becoming a father for the first time at age 58, that when his 2 sons would really begin to know him, that he'd be an older man. And in Dad's Maybe book, he shares wisdom from a life in letters, lessons learned in wartime, and the challenges, humor, and rewards of raising 2 sons. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Amy Lewis Hoffland, Executive Director of the Crow Museum of Asian Art of the University of Texas at Dallas, who will introduce Pico Iyer. The Crow Museum, as you well know, is the preeminent museum in the southern United States dedicated to the arts and culture of Asia. And if you haven't yet seen their beautiful exhibition, Hands and Earth, Contemporary Japanese Ceramics, I encourage you to do that before it closes in early January. Amy is devoted to her work, both at the museum and also to creating a more compassionate society. She recently led the Dallas Arts District's signing of the International Charter for Compassion, and she also chairs the Dallas Arts District Board. Amy will lead our luncheon book club discussion of Pico Iyer's book, Autumn Light, on Wednesday, November 6th in the DMA's Cook Boardroom, and I hope you'll join us for that event as well. It'll be a wonderful way to delve deeper into the themes of the book that you'll be hearing about tonight. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Amy Hoffland.
Good evening, and thank you, Carolyn, for tonight and for 20 years of meaningful collaborations. Welcome to all to this beautiful arts district in one of Dallas's most luminous months, filled with autumn light. Let's take a moment to arrive. We've come from many different places and experiences today, and sometimes it takes just a moment of awareness, of silence, to arrive in the place where we are. I invite you, if you're willing, to sit and close your eyes at the sound of the bell and take a few deep breaths, allowing your breath to become natural. And we'll just be here for a moment. Thank you. Pico Iyer teaches us many things about the experience of this life. Let's begin this evening with the experience of seeing each other. Please take a moment to turn to the person next to you, whether you know them or not, on the right or the left, ahead or behind of you, and say hello and introduce yourself. Just a moment. Now I would love for the person in the back corner just to wave down to the person here in the front on your left. If you all would just kind of wave at each other, just across the room. And then from this corner, maybe in the last row, if you'll wave, I think that's Carolyn, actually, if you'll wave down to the person here in the lower right. Have we arrived in a new way? Joyful, connected, and alive. This is my hope as we create a space, a sacred space, for the presence and shared wisdom of our guest, Mr. Pico Iyer. Pico teaches us that if we live this way, every day can last 1,000 hours. Each moment is precious and can stretch out before us, receptive to meaning, purpose, and love. Japan as a country has taught Pico Iyer many things. Notably, life is a joyful participation in a world of sorrow. He notes Japan is a culture of wistfulness and buoyancy. There is wisdom in his words and how he lives his life. A global soul, Iyer was introduced to Japan over 30 years ago on an extended layover at the Narita airport. His arrival, on paper, was an accident. By the universe, just part of how the world opened up to him that day. A few hours later, he was bravely designing a new life, leaving his job as a writer and planning a transcultural, transcontinental move to Japan. Born Siddharth Pico Raghavan Iyer in Oxford, England, Pico is the descendant of writers and scholars. His name is the combination of Buddha's name, Siddhartha, and that of a Florin Neoplatonist, Pico della Mirandola, and his father's name. Iyer was, and likely is, a child of the world, educated in his youth between Santa Barbara, California, and schools in England. He was groomed to wonder, to wander, and to write. In his teens, he met His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, a tutelage that continues today with continued exchanges of love and wisdom between two humble monks. Distinguished as a King's Scholar at Eton College, Iyer holds a degree from Eton, a double degree from Oxford University, and a master's from Harvard University, where he would go on to teach before joining Time magazine. 10 years later, he was meeting Japan for the first time. This encounter with Japanese culture gave Pico Iyer a new home. A longtime sweetheart, Hiroko Takeuchi, the lady referred to in his book, The Lady and the Monk, 4 Seasons in Kyoto. A new family and a newfound sense of silence. He was home. Today, in this moment, and 14 books later, he is here in Dallas to share his reflections of Autumn Light and A Beginner's Guide to Japan, both released this year. This global soul has never owned a cell phone, yet he could likely be your Siri, your Alexa, and your Google of Japan without even having to ask. His offerings are beautiful, bountiful, and generous, as he moves between the spaces of the outer world and the inner world. His knowledge of this place, marked by time and impermanence, is his place, respectfully borrowed for a few decades as he follows the rules of Japanese culture and acknowledges that it is a sacred place, saturated with spirit and energy, the energy of quiet. As the writer Tanizaki praises shadows, Pico Iyer praises the lovely quiet that falls there and our need to find it. Please welcome Pico Iyer. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Amy, for such a soulful and eloquent and generous introduction. Anything's going to be an anticlimax after that, and I can't begin to say anything that would live up to that. But thank you also for such a human introduction. I was listening to the audience introduce themselves to one another, and it sounded like they were really having fun, which maybe the last fun they'll have this evening. So I'm glad you gave us and them that opportunity. And also, I loved the moment of silence. And as you know, because you know Asian art so well, silence is almost more essential in Japan than speech. So that seemed to me like the appropriately, perfectly Japanese way to begin the evening, cleansing and liberating us, and actually reminding us the less we say, the happier we are. I'm just so really, really thrilled to be back in this auditorium. Today is the fourth time I've ever been in Dallas. The first time, I never forget, July the 4th, 1975. I was a teenager and I was going across country in a Greyhound bus, and for reasons unknown to myself, I got off at Dallas, downtown. I went to a theater. I saw 3 movies for $1. Those were the days. And then I got back in the bus and continued to California. But somehow it's always stayed with me, the notion in those days you could get a triple bill for $1. The second time I came to Dallas was maybe 35 years after that for a conference, which was held at one of the airport hotels. And we had rich and fascinating discussions for 3 days, but we never actually left the airport. And you all know this, I think, but for me it was my introduction to the fact, extraordinary, that Dallas-Fort Worth Airport statistically is larger than the whole of Manhattan. I think in terms of acreage, it's probably the largest airport in the world, and it's a whole city in itself. My third trip here was to the museum, thanks to my friend Carolyn. And that was a memorable day, too, because I think there was a tornado, or one way or another, none of the audience could leave at the end of the event. So really a captive audience in every form. And we turned it into an impromptu party. I remember all of us were here until quite late in the evening, and decided to make the most of it in that great Japanese spirit. And today is the 4th time, again, thanks to Carolyn, and you probably notice there's an ascending arc. Each trip is getting better than the previous one. And thankfully, just 20 minutes ago, I got to go upstairs and see the beautiful exhibition of Hiroshige's 53 stations of the Tokaido. And Amy was mentioning how my life was changed during a layover near Tokyo at the airport. But I think even when I was a little boy, I remember I would look at those Hiroshige paintings and I would feel I knew them and understood them better than I knew the neighborhood where I grew up or the apartment where I happened to live. And I just was overwhelmed with this sense of familiarity, as if I was meeting a secret friend or a secret home. And I think it was really seeing Hiroshige at an early age that propelled me towards Japan. So among all of you, if any of you go up to see the Hiroshige exhibition, there may be 1 or 2 who find, as I did, that your lives will be changed by it, or you'll find a place you recognize even though you've never seen it. 6 years ago, I was in Key West, Florida, for a literary event, and suddenly, in the dead of night, the phone rang. And it was my wife, Hiroko, whom Amy was mentioning, from her hometown in Kyoto, saying that her father, who was 91 years old, but who had been bounding around Kyoto the previous week, had suddenly been taken into the hospital. And unfortunately, I had various obligations in Florida, and 3 days later, the phone rang again, and it was Hiroko saying that her father was gone. And I think a death in the family everywhere is a wake-up call, and it's a cause for sober reflection. And I'm guessing that the emotions that follow upon a death are pretty much universal. But in Japan, the rites that follow upon a death are very distinct. As soon as her father died, Hiroko had to buy a very expensive Buddhist name to protect her father in the afterworld. She then had to buy an even more expensive gravestone. To this day, 6 years after that death, she wakes up very early every morning. She heats up water for her father's favorite cup of tea. She gathers his favorite snacks, and she puts them out for him on the household altar, which happens to be right next to the boombox in which she'll soon be blasting out Green Day's 21st Century Nervous Breakdown. And every day when she gets a holiday from her job selling sort of semi-punky European clothes in a department store, she gets into a bus, and then a train, and a second train, and a third train for a 2-hour trip each way to what in Japan is called a city of tomorrow, a graveyard, to fill in her long-departed grandmother and her late father on all the family news. On a practical level, as soon as her father passed away, she had to move her 86-year-old mother, whom her father had been looking after, into a nursing home. She had to get a will signed by her brother, which sounded very easy because he lives only 15 minutes away, but actually was really hard because he had cut off the entire family 25 years earlier on the grounds, he enigmatically said, that his sister had gotten a divorce. And our daughter, who had been living in Spain, came back to Japan with her Spanish boyfriend, but we didn't really know if she was back for good or if we would soon lose her, maybe forever, to Europe. And so suddenly we were in this wilderness of questions. And I came back into the autumn, and I always try really hard to be in Japan in the autumn. And I know you have a crisp and sunlit autumn here in Dallas, and I used to live in New York City and in Boston, which has beautiful fall foliage. But as Amy was saying, there's something about the poignancy of the Japanese fall and the way the poignancy plays off the exuberance that really pierces me. And again, Amy was citing that wisdom you hear a lot in Japan about life being a joyful participation in a world of sorrows. And I truly feel that sorrow and that joy more penetratingly in the autumn in Japan than I've ever known it anywhere else. Now, after all that high-toned introduction, I should probably confess that if any of you were to visit our apartment in Japan, you'd be horrified, just really appalled. We live in a 2-room, entirely Western apartment, so no tatami mats, no exquisite shoji screens. And our apartment is in a completely Western neighborhood that was built in the late 1970s, more or less to look like a Steven Spielberg stage set. Nearly all the buildings in our neighborhood are Western style. All the streets are absolutely straight. There's not a single shrine or temple in the whole community. And the two main drags are literally called Park Dory and School Dory, using the English names, as if to convince my mostly elderly retired neighbors that they've finally attained their dream of living in a Japanese version of California. But our completely synthetic mock American suburb is on the outskirts of the great old city of Nara, which was the capital of Japan in the year 710. And today, Nara is a big, bustling city. It's more populous than Cincinnati or Pittsburgh. But right at the heart of Nara, in downtown, is the largest municipal park in the whole country. And it is studded with temples and shrines, reflecting ponds, sutra houses, and most visibly, 1,200 wild deer who roam around the whole city untamed and essentially rule the place. If you go to the City Hall, which is a big 5-story glass and concrete building, you'll usually find stags literally seated on the front steps as if they're city councillors. If you check into the fanciest hotel in Nara, you'll be greeted not by doormen, but by doe. And so this image of a quasi-Californian suburb on the brink of somewhere ancient and deep and filled with spirits is very much how I see Japan, even in the 21st century. For many years, right across the street from our apartment was a health club. And in those days, whenever she had a day off, my wife would get up and she'd put on headbands and leggings and go across the street for 8 hours of kickboxing or high-intensity aerobics or weight training or jazzercise or yoga or all kinds of things. You can tell already her husband is so shaky I can barely stand at this podium without collapsing in a heap. But my wife is Japanese, which means she is graced with patience. And so 17 years after we first met, she came back from the health club one day and she said, "Oh, didn't you used to play ping pong as a boy?" I confessed I did. And she said, "Oh, you know, they're offering ping pong now in the health club." Gentle hint. Well, I snarled something defensive, but a few weeks later, I did agree to go across the street with her to look at the ping pong. And as she had imagined, or maybe as she had feared, within 3 minutes, I was lost to ping pong for life. I have lived in Japan now for 32 years on a tourist visa, because I've never really wanted to engage with official corporate Japan, which seems to me to involve some of the less imaginative and interesting sides of the culture. And I've always been drawn to everything private and domestic and interior in that culture. But in the ping pong club, suddenly I was the lone foreigner in a group of 30 Japanese people, mostly retired executives, grandmothers, a proprietress or two of a red light bar, all kinds of different people. And at my tiring 5'7.5", barely able to see over this podium, I was almost the tallest in the whole group. In my 50s, I was the youngest by decades. And when my wife occasionally looked in on the ping pong proceedings, she was alarmed to notice that her hairless, hapless husband was a kind of Justin Bieber figure, a teen idol by comparison with my friends in their 80s. And I think my Japanese neighbors were actually genuinely quite happy to have a token foreigner in their midst as a kind of mascot. And so the ping pong club really became my way of learning how to fit into a Japanese group, which, among other things, means trying really hard with every breath, but never wanting to win. And maybe I'll just read a little section about how this all plays out. To enter Japan through the narrow gateway of ping pong, it didn't sound like any of the loftier ideas I'd had when I came over to Kyoto, weighed down by readings of old poets and philosophers. I'd moved to Japan, I thought, to learn how to live with less hurry and fear of time, to see how an old and seasoned culture makes its peace with the passing hours. I'd moved there to learn how best to dissolve a sense of self within something larger and less temporary. But now, to step into the health club or on Saturday afternoons the old drafty gym feels like stepping into the thick of a society in the middle of a convivial, long-running drama in which I have to tease out every turn and nuance. At the ping pong club, I have to learn how to be invisible and how to read the unwritten rules that guide us. How to compete not to win, but to make sure that as many people as possible feel that they are winners. How, in short, to be a voice within a choral symphony rather than a soloist tootling off on his own. Soon after Hiroko urged me to give the game a try, I stepped into the studio to be greeted by a smooth, warm man in his late 60s with rimless glasses and a few words of English. Next to him was a smiling, shiningly gracious woman who might have been welcoming me to an elegant dinner party. As they introduced me round, Pico-san's a writer. He comes from California. The emperor, as I began to think of him, inducted me into the customs of the place. The sign-up sheet, the 30-minute segments, the way we had to run up and down the studio in parallel lines with mops as soon as we were through to make sure that the space was as immaculate as when we had entered. Then he started seeking out players of my level with whom I could practice. Very soon, however, I sensed that it was everything silent, as always in Japan, that bound us together. My friends were exceptional when practicing. Even the weakest players could keep a high-speed rally going for minutes. But get them into a game and hit it where they weren't expecting it, and they were instantly at a loss. They were born for duets, I realized. Playing with each other was their strength, treating each other as a part of themselves, as in a duet or an act of love. Playing against each other never would be. I learned, therefore, never to say a word about the result of any game, even though some of my friends would hoot and improvise a war dance if they scored a victory. In any case, we switched off pairs so rapidly that nobody lost for long, and best of two games guaranteed that there weren't so many losers. If ever there was just one person in the room when I arrived, I learned never to contemplate a game of singles. Our job was to rally with each other until two others showed up and practiced enough to be ready for some doubles. I learned never to leave so long as there were even numbers in the studio. One person's departure would throw three others off, and how discreetly to leave as soon as a newcomer arrived if that left us with an odd number. If I did go home before the others, I had to turn towards everyone when I reached the door, bow deeply, and say, "Please, excuse me for leaving before the rest of you." One afternoon, as I was exchanging forehands with the Federer graceful empress, her husband placed a kindly hand on my shoulder and said, "Pico-san, why don't you hit a few with Nakai-san?" Nakai-san was a tiny man with a sweet, clumsy smile and the air of a geek, not least because he was the only one to come into the studio carrying a stylish man purse instead of an Adidas bag full of equipment. He hit my balls back, but always a little tentatively, like a boy in a science lab who's trying to pour some semi-poisonous liquid into a test tube. I learned how to take spins off my shots so he could always block them back, and soon we were something of a dance team ourselves. One bright morning, however, I saw him stepping out of a long, very new black Mercedes sedan outside the post office, leaving the engine running, and I realized, many months too late, Nakai-san was a professional gangster. The rare soul who had decided to ignore that section of the health club registration that requires every prospective member to confirm I have no tattoos and I am not a member of any criminal organization. And I was the ideal person to be encouraged to play with him as a kind of outlier, too. So this particular autumn went on, and I think all of us were keenly aware, as you all know, that if a couple's been together for 60 years and one of them leaves the earth, the other often goes very, very soon thereafter. So we were really on edge to see how long my mother-in-law would last. We were still waiting to see whether my missing brother-in-law would ever come back to say goodbye to his late father or to his fast-failing mother. And, of course, I began thinking about my own mother, who was then 82, living alone on top of a mountain in California, regularly encircled by forest fire flames. And I was thinking how if I tended to my mother-in-law, I was neglecting my mother, and if I went to see my mother, I was ignoring my mother-in-law. Every now and then, friends of mine from this country would come to Japan, and nearly always, if they were there for the first time, they would ask me about religion. And I would hear myself say that in some respects, and you can see this in the paintings upstairs, the guiding religion of Japan is the seasons, which of course is a religion without texts, without dogmas, without exclusions, but it's a constant education in changelessness and change. And in Japan, following the precedent of classical China, there are 72 seasons in every year. So there's a new season every 5 days, and food and clothes, everything really changes accordingly. Certainly in late November, when the tiny 5-pointed maples blaze against these radiant blue skies, all my neighbors put on their Sunday best and they flock out into temple gardens and parks. I think much the way people here might go to church, in order to be joined in a congregation and to be put in place, reminded of forces much larger than we are, and to catch flashes of light amidst the coming darkness. For those of you who haven't experienced the Japanese autumn, the skies are blazingly blue and warm, warmer than Southern California, actually, until the early days of December. But underneath the blue are the golds and scarlets and lemon yellows of the turning leaves. And some of you may have been to Japan, and you may have heard how in Japan they use a different word for the self that exists in private from the self that's abroad, out in the public world. And I think it's pretty much assumed that there need be no real connection between the two. And I've always thought that cherry blossoms, which are frothy and giggly and pink, a little erotic, that's almost the face that Japan likes to present to the outside world on posters and postcards. But deep down in its heart, I think Japan is the maple leaf and that mingling of radiance and melancholy. And this being the Dallas Museum, some of you may know the films of the great Japanese director of the 1950s, especially Ozu, Tokyo Story, Late Spring, many others. And if you've seen one of his movies, you'll know that quite often there's the sound of a festival out in the street, even as somebody is sobbing in the room next door. And that, to me, is what Japan, especially in the autumn, is all about. And that's what, in my book, Autumn Light, I was really trying to see the many ways in which joy and sorrow, beauty and sadness are inextricable. So maybe I'll read a section about autumn as we find it in our apartment and neighborhood. As November dawns, we step into a world of light. The whole room seems to pulse with smudged gold as the sun rises above the hills beyond us and comes through the diffusing thick panes of our frosted glass windows. I remember my surprise when Hiroko told me that the builder of this place, who ended up calling it Memphis Apartments in honor of Elvis, originally wanted to make it a church. The heavy pebbled glass spreads light as if it were incense. Now she puts Bach on our system, and very soon the sun is making gold stripes across the terrace with such extravagance that I'm pulled in every direction all at once. A great rejoicing, so it feels, which awakens gratitude and delight. But the sun is passing across the terrace earlier and earlier, and by mid-afternoon it will disappear behind a roof. It's nearly impossible to stay indoors on a day like this, not least because so many around me are being pulled almost magnetically out into the sharpened sunshine to marvel at the fact that the sky is so blue even as the leaves rust and begin to flutter down. Many of Kyoto's temples open their gates after nightfall now, another of the city's fresh and ingenious seductions, and soon we'll follow lanterns past stands of bamboo eerily lit up. watch fast-moving ghosts holographically projected upon raked sand gardens. In the shallow crystal pond of Kodaiji, the five-pointed maples are almost more brilliant than on the trees that the temple's water reflects. In our private lives, however, we are perched on the edge of a cliff, and the slightest movement could send us tumbling over. Every time I come back to the flat, I look by instinct for the green flashing button on the phone. No news is likely to be good news. And when I walk into the park, I can't help but wonder how often my mother-in-law will see the maples again. I take myself to banish the thought to the nearest shrine, where the light is slicing the courtyard into diamonds. And I notice, as never before, that people have placed coins around rocks all across the forest. There are stone lanterns everywhere, as if the whole wilderness were some haunted church. I decide to take a train into central Nara today. I can't afford to squander this moment. And in the sun-washed carriage, I find myself looking at the hands on every side of me, tapping away on a smartphone, tightly gripping the handle of a designer bag, holding a toddler steady as the train rocks and rattles. The one part of Japan in which age cannot be concealed, hands tell the truth even when mouths and eyes cannot, is also the most beautiful. In the deer park, an old woman has set herself on a bench to transcribe the autumn colors in a sketchbook. Two toddlers are stumbling their way into learning how to walk on the grass nearby. A deer is chasing some poor visitor into the store next to where special deer cookies are on sale for the equivalent of $1.50 each. If they're true messengers of the gods, these deer speak for gods as ungovernable as Zeus or Hera. Around me, there's a chorus. Wow, aren't the maples beautiful? And the chorus itself lends brightness to the day. A woman leads her dog, wrapped in a red blanket, up a slope and stops and tilts her head up, 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 to where the leaves are picked out against the blue. Quite something, no, she says to her four-legged companion. A young girl in a denim jacket with frills guides her grandmother very slowly by the hand, then sets her down in front of the turning leaves, a perfect autumn tableau. Would you like? A passing woman suggests, and the girl hands over her camera and hurries off to take her place next to the old lady. Now you? Asks the granddaughter, springing up. Across the world, people are marking the Day of the Dead today. But in the park, the air so cleansed that the trees seem to gleam in the freshened morning. It's not skeletons I see, so much as aging elders struggling for breath. Dying is the art we have to master, it seems to say, not death. Late love settles into us as spring romances never could. I think one of the things I was trying to do in this book, Autumn Light, is to remind us how, at the human emotional level, Japan, of course, is really not so different from Texas or Europe or anywhere. I think when you arrive first in Japan, you're often most struck by everything modern and Western and zany, all the things that we hear about a lot in the media. Hotels that are staffed almost entirely by robots, wild goth fashions. And the phenomenon which is really getting a lot of play over here these days, whereby if an elderly couple don't have a daughter to look in on them, or if she's moved to Dallas with her American husband, they will literally go to an agency and hire an actress to come and visit them every Sunday afternoon and knock on the door, say, "Hi, Mom, hi, Dad, I've really missed you. Let's spend a beautiful Sunday afternoon together." And they will suspend disbelief to fill that hole in their hearts. It sounds strange to us, but I think to them it's a very practical solution to a real problem. On the other hand, of course, if you live in a family and a community and a neighborhood as I do, you really see, as I was saying, that it's the same story as anywhere else, even if it plays out in another language. And every time I go to the post office, the women around me are talking about the waiting lists at nursing homes and the fact they'll feel really guilty if they move their mother to a nursing home and really frazzled if they don't. And almost that human equivalent to climate change, I was just talking to Carolyn about that backstage, whereby humans are living longer than we've ever lived before, but in so many cases for years after our minds and our memories have begun to come apart. So in some ways, this book, Autumn Light, is really a book for anyone who's had a parent and anyone who's known an autumn, anyone who's suffered a loss. But just in case, on the 1 in a million chance that you don't enjoy this book, I wrote, I did a crazy thing. I wrote an absolutely contradictory book about Japan at the same time for the same publisher to come out in the same season, the one that Amy was mentioning called A Beginner's Guide to Japan. And if the first book, Autumn Light, is really about all the ways in which Japan is not so different from us, the second book is about the many ways in which it's a deeply foreign place. I've lived there 32 years, and it still feels like another planet, almost, to me. And the first book is really an attempt almost for Japanese neighborhood to present itself to you unmediated, just so you feel as if you're in that neighborhood. And the second book is almost the chance for you to talk back to it, and the kind of thoughts or generalities that might come to you if you arrived tomorrow evening in Narita Airport near Tokyo and started to take in this very different seeming place. So this second book addresses all the burning questions I'm sure you've always been asking, such as, how does an evening with Meryl Streep perfectly explain Japan? Why does a baseball game in Japan, if the score is level after 12 innings, end in a tie? Why is anime the perfect expression of an animist culture? And why is it better often in Kyoto to say nothing at all than anything? You've probably figured out already by now, looking at me, I am of Indian ancestry. And one result of that is that my mind is like a kind of Bollywood stage set in overdrive, singing, dancing, caterwauling, somersaulting round the clock in overbright, riotous colors. So I worked very hard to keep my mind out of that first book, Autumn Light, and then I just poured it all into the second book and describe how, for example, in Japan, if you have an emergency, you don't dial 911, you dial 119. And why the wartime emperor of Japan in 1975 told a group of journalists, well, when I look at pre-war Japan and post-war Japan, I think there's no difference. To us, the transformation of Japan was one of the most dramatic moments and changes in the 20th century. And I think I partly wrote two contradictory books about the same place because, as you all know, if you feel strongly about a place or a person or a subject, you're likely to have conflicting feelings about it. And what you think at 10 in the morning is very different from what you feel at 2 in the afternoon. The heart says one thing, the head says another. And I think living in Japan has really taught me that to some extent every thought is temporary. Every feeling is fleeting. Almost like the clouds, if you see them through a James Turrell sky space. And in Kyoto, they sometimes say every reverse has a reverse. So these two books just keep on reversing one another, and anything you read in one of them is probably upended in the other. I did spend those 16 years working on these books, and they're both very small, embarrassingly small. But I spent those 16 years really trying to keep everything out in honor of the Japanese aesthetic. And that sense, which you all know if you've lost somebody in your life through a breakup or a death, that absence can fill us up more than a presence. Somebody who's not in the room can hold us more than 20 other people who are in the room. And I'm sure you all know that if you go into a classic Japanese tatami room, there'll be nothing there except a vase and a scroll. And because there's nothing else there, you bring all your attention to the vase and the scroll, and you find everything you could want and much, much more just in those two things. Quite apart from that, and even not in Japan, I'm sure many of you have had the experience of going into a room your sweetheart's room, in fact, when she's not there. And you'll see a strand of hair, or a postcard on the wall, or a letter that she's writing. And somehow she will come home to you in all her hopes, her longings, her vulnerability, in a way she never would if she were just 2 feet in front of you talking. And I think, again, that's a bit the effect I was trying to get in these books. So just to conclude, the autumn I was describing in the Autumn Light book continued. I found myself walking around the temple where I'd met my wife 32 years ago, and the Zen abbot in whose temple we met was always so glad we met on his home terrain. He used to call himself our Cupid, but he had passed away. And Hiroko, like many people, I think, who has lost a parent, would sometimes feel her father walking and talking through her. And I would return to the ping pong club, and it was always a terrific scene of laughter and merriment. But sometimes somebody would be missing, and they would never come back. And I would hear words like cancer and hometown and death. And every November, the Dalai Lama comes to visit Japan, and every November, my wife and I travel with him for every minute of his official day as he goes across the country. So I thought it might be appropriate to end this part of the program with a reading in which we visit him in his hotel in Kyoto, and we remember a trip we took with him a couple of years before that. As we say hello to the Dalai Lama, I recall the November day 2 years ago when we traveled up with him to a fishing village north of Tokyo, laid waste by the tsunami of 8 months earlier. A few miles out of the city of Sendai, we began passing along clean, modern roads lined by nothing but compacted trash, block-long rectangles of smashed cars and refuse. Telephone poles listed at 45-degree angles. A solitary chair sat in the open skeleton of what had once been a living room. Buses bobbed on the water beside us. When we pulled up at Ishinomaki, hundreds had gathered along the road there behind ropes to greet the famous visitor. It was to see nothing but a flattened landscape which looked like pictures I'd seen of Hiroshima after the bomb. More than 3,000 had lost their lives in this village alone, many of them children. 19,000 had lost their homes. The Dalai Lama stepped out of his car and strode without hesitation to the people, mostly women, who had assembled in the street to see him. Many were sobbing or calling out in limited English, "Thank you, thank you." He held one person's head against his chest. He blessed another. He touched heads, shook hands, looked into one set of eyes, then the next, asking, "What do you feel? Are you still sad?" "Please," he told them as the women sobbed and others pushed forwards, "please be brave. Please change your hearts. You cannot change what has happened. Please help everyone else. Help others become okay." The crowd fell quiet. Some of its members nodded. "Too many people died," he went on. "If you worry, it can't help them. Please, work hard. That's the best offering you can make to the ones you lost. Rebuild your community as your country rebuilt itself after the war." It's the kind of advice that anyone might give, perhaps, but when he turned around to walk towards the temple that had survived, gravestones in the foreground tilted crazily over or knocked down entirely, I saw the Dalai Lama take off his glasses and wipe away a tear himself. Suffering is the central fact of life from his Buddhist viewpoint. It's what we do with it that defines our lives. Just one day later, we return with the Dalai Lama and his bodyguards to the hotel, hasten up in the elevator to the top floor, and walk at high speed down the corridor with him to his room. His eyes are often red after a long day of events, but his pace never slackens. He's holding Hiroko's hand as he moves forwards. As in some physical expression of his teachings, he reflexively reaches for any set of hands to grasp between his own as he strides along. Just before we arrive at his door, Hiroko says, "Your Holiness, we must leave you now, but thank you for everything." He's on his way to Tokyo next day. We have obligations at home. Also, she says, and her voice begins to falter just a little, "I want to tell you, my father passed away this year." Instantly, the fast-stepping monk stops. He looks at her directly. "When?" "This year." "What cause?" "No cause. He was old. His body was tired." He steps forwards and holds her a long, long time. Then he steps back and looks searchingly at her. "Remember, only body gone, spirit still there, only cover gone." Then he heads into his room and at the threshold turns around to wave at us briskly, "Good night, thank you," and then is gone as we head back into the golden flares of late afternoon. Thank you so much for listening so quietly and so patiently. I have much more to say, and I think we actually have maybe 30 minutes for questions. So please, I think there are microphones on both sides, and if you have questions about what I read or what I didn't read, if you have questions about anything, I'd love to hear them.
Thank you for being here. I'm a fan of James Turrell, and you mentioned skyscapes. Are there any in Japan?
Oh, you've asked the perfect question. I can say too much about that. And actually, in my beginner's guide to Japan, there's a whole section about the magical complex of islands in the Japanese inland sea around Naoshima. And this being an art museum, some of you may know about it or may even have been there. But during the Japanese economic boom in the late 1980s, a textbook publishing company, had this remarkable idea of taking over a deserted fisherman's island, which was really impoverished and was falling behind, and converting it into a complex of museums. And now they've extended that project to 2 neighboring islands. And it's really one of the most transfixing and beautiful spaces I've ever seen. And the last time I was in Dallas, I asked my host, Carolyn, to take me to the Turrell in the sculpture garden across the street because I'd been introduced to his work on this island of Naoshima. And so the whole southern half of the island was given over to the Japanese architect Tadao Ando, whom most of you probably know from the Fort Worth Kimball Museum. And together with Turrell, they really built a series of spaces, the most glorious of which is a museum built almost entirely underground, which essentially has only 5 rooms. One room is a Walter de Maria piece, and you walk in and it's just this gold reflecting sphere. And as you walk around it, because it's lit naturally, it keeps changing as the sky changes, and you are part of the piece. As you approach it, you see yourself, and as other people approach it, they become works of art. So that's one piece. Another room consists of 5 Monets against absolutely white walls, again with natural light, so that as the day darkens, they almost turn into Rothkos. They just become darker and darker and deeper and deeper. And right next to that are 3 Turrell pieces, the most memorable of which is a sky space. So for those of you who haven't seen it, you walk into an all-white chamber, relatively small. There are pews on every side. You sit down. There's a square cut out in the ceiling, and you just look up. And for me, for the first time ever, I realized, wait a minute, the sky itself is a work of art. And then a black crow goes across, and then a fleece of clouds, and then an airplane. And I actually spent 4 hours just sitting there looking up at the sky, something I'd never thought to look at before. And then when I left the Turrell room and walked to the Monet room, suddenly I saw that's what Monet was doing, really, giving us panels of water, much like the panels of the sky. And then I went back to the Turrell, and I saw that he was really investigating light and color, just the way Monet was, and that both of them are in some ways Japanese artists. And so across this island of Naoshima, which I strongly recommend, there are other Turrell pieces too. Most notably, he and the architect Ando took over, I think, a dark building that was a temple. And you walk inside and you sit down at the back, and it's pitch black. There's nothing there, so you really can't move. You just sit there for 10 minutes, and slowly your eyes adjust, and you realize at the far end of the room is this pulsing white screen. And again, it's an exercise in seeing how much is there if only you have eyes to look, and how much we walk past or sleepwalk past in our daily life. And I think Turrell is essentially teaching us about attention, which is a great Japanese gift. How if you bring your full attention to everything, as I was saying about the empty room, you see everything that you need right there. And I noticed after my first day in the Turrell sky space, as I walked back to my hotel, everything I saw along the road looked like a work of art. I'd see a Japanese couple, and I'd wonder if they were an installation. I'd look out at the inland sea, and I'd realize that that itself was a beautiful Monet or Turrell. And I'd walked along that same road on the way to the museum and not noticed anything. So many museums, like this one, give you something extraordinary to see, but that's a museum that teaches you how to see, and actually how to see the extraordinary, even in the ordinary. So you clearly asked just the right question. Since I first got to that island and saw my first Turrell, as with many people who go there, it's become a bit of an obsession. And I'm still waiting to get to Fort Worth to see the Ando building, which was being bewitchingly described to me earlier today, how you feel like you're floating because of the effect of the water when you're actually sitting inside it. I'll just end by saying I was once having maybe the most miserable week of my year at a university in California. I'd been invited to spend a week there. The students weren't at all happy to see me. The faculty were even less happy to see me. They put me up in an apartment which didn't even have a refrigerator. I was just counting the days till I could be away from the place. And then I remembered that I had a friend from high school in England who was living there, so I went and had dinner with him. And at the end of the dinner, he said, do you know that there's a James Turrell piece here? And of course, I didn't know. So although it was late at night, he took me to this courtyard within the university, which was a sort of open rectangle that Turrell had set up so you could look at the sky. Because Turrell studied at that university and he gave it as a present, as an alumnus. And so the next morning I woke up very early, I went to Starbucks, I got my tea and my muffin, and I just sat in the Turrell space as the light came up. And suddenly my whole day, my whole week was transfigured. And this really grim and painful week became a beautiful week, just because from then on, every morning I would go and start the day by sitting in this Turrell chapel of contemplation and just seeing the light come into the California day. And I owe all of that to a Japanese island and the Japanese businessman who was wise enough to realize that James Turrell was the perfect artist for Japan. Thank you for the question.
How did you and your wife become companions and friends of the Dalai Lama?
I warned Carolyn beforehand, my hearing's really weak. I'm sorry, I couldn't catch that.
How did you and your wife become friends and companions of the Dalai Lama?
Oh, yes. Really just good luck and inheritance on my part. When the Dalai Lama first came into exile in 1959, my family was living in England. But my father was a philosopher, and he knew a lot about Buddhism. And so he was one of the relatively few people who realized that for the first time in history, this great repository of wisdom and Tibetan knowledge was available to the rest of the world. So my father sailed all the way back to India to meet the newly arrived Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama, as soon as he came into exile, for his part, thought, now this is my first chance to meet all kinds of people from every walk of life. So he was very open to meeting people. He invited my father up to see him. They had a long conversation. And at the end of that conversation, my father said, well, Your Holiness, I've got this little 3-year-old kid back in England, and he took a very keen interest in the story of your flight over the highest mountains on earth to get to safety. And the Dalai Lama's great gift is always for finding the common ground between himself and whomever he meets. So then and there, he found a photograph of himself when he was 4 years old, already on the lion throne in Lhasa, ruler of 6 million Tibetans and 14 million Tibetan Buddhists, and he sent it to me, age 3, back in England. And I put it in a frame and had it on my desk all the time I was growing up. And I can still remember every now and then, if I was feeling a little sorry for myself, and I was thinking, gosh, life can be difficult for a little kid who's alone, far from any relative in the world. I only had to look at that picture and see a 4-year-old ruling 14 million people, and I was put into perspective. I couldn't feel sorry for myself anymore. And the first time I met the Dalai Lama was when I was a teenager, and my father took me with him up to the Dalai Lama's house in northern India to spend an afternoon with him. At 17, of course, I couldn't understand much of what they were saying, but some seed was planted in my head. And 5 years after that, the Dalai Lama first began coming to this country, and because of that early meeting, I would go and see him. And it's remarkable to remember, or to imagine now, how in the 1980s, really nobody had heard of the Dalai Lama. Most of the people I knew didn't know if he was some mythical being or some real person. And he would come to New York when I was living there in the early 80s, and give a press conference. 5 people would be there, 4 Tibetans and me. I remember once at that time I was working for Time magazine, so I organized a lunch for the Dalai Lama to meet the editors of Time magazine, because I thought that would be useful for him. And 2 hours before the lunch, one of the editors rang me up and said, oh, blow this guy off. We don't want to come into the office on a Monday just to meet some monk. 4 years later, of course, those same editors were flying across the world just to get 10 minutes with the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala. But in 1984, he really wasn't on anybody's radar. And I think because I met him then, I also started visiting Tibet as soon as it opened up to the world in 1985. And the Dalai Lama has a startlingly good memory. Sometimes when I'll see him, he'll say, oh, I remember the last time I saw your father. He was wearing a yellow shirt. And I'll realize the last time he saw my father was 23 years previously. And of course, he's meeting maybe 2,000 new people every day, but not a detail escapes him. So he always remembers that he's known me for 45 years now. And because Buddhism is so imperiled in Tibet itself, and because actually no other Buddhist nation will invite him to visit, because the presence of China, the only significant Buddhist country he can go to is Japan. So he takes the trouble to go to Japan every year. I wrote a book about him in 2008, based on my first 34 years with him. And after that book came out, he invited me actually to be next to him on all his tours across Japan and sometimes elsewhere. So we have lunch with him every day, and he allows us to sit in on all his private meetings. And of course, it's a wonderful opportunity. 1 minute he's talking to heavy metal musicians, the next to politicians, the next to scientists, the next to religious leaders. And it's amazing to see him switch from one role to the next at lightning speed, and somehow, I think, find the right thing to say to everyone. So really, just good fortune that I happen to get to know him, and doubly good fortune that he comes to Japan every year, though now he's 84, and I think maybe he won't be coming to Japan so much.
Pico, thank you very much. I first visited Japan in the early 80s, and my first trip to Japan, I really noted the role of women in Japan. I don't want to use the word gender equality, but I think it was remarkably missing in the early 80s. I've probably been back to Japan 15 or 20 times since, and I keep thinking every time I go back, I'm going to see something different. And actually, on my last trip, I came back and I noted the fact that nothing has really changed since my first visit in '82. What are your thoughts on that? What is the role of women in Japan today? And is there a sense of gender equality like we have in this country?
you couldn't have asked a better and more beautiful question. And I agree with every syllable you said. You said word for word exactly what I say. In fact, I first visited Japan in 1983, almost the same time as you. And after my first year in Japan, in 1988, I wrote a book about how I met my wife, which was essentially about the predicament of women who are relegated to second-class citizenship status on the margins of life, given no opportunity for public positions, and therefore have every incentive to want to escape Japan, to join a foreign company, to learn a foreign language, or even, in this case, to marry someone as unpromising as I. And exactly as you were saying, I keep on waiting for a change, and I haven't seen any. 30 years after I wrote that book, it's exactly the same, just as you were saying. And I think in its treatment of women, in its treatment of foreigners, and its treatment of the LGBT community, really of everybody who's different, Japan remains 50 or 100 years behind the rest of the world, which is often progressing and more out of sync with it. As you know, I'm sure, and as you were saying, if Prime Minister Abe were here, he would say 60% of women have jobs, which is more than in the United States. What he wouldn't say is most of them literally live below the poverty level if they don't have husbands, and that many mothers are reduced to prostitution just to try to support their children. Divorce, as you know, is always regarded as the mother's fault in Japan, and it's really shocking. One of the things, actually, the reasons that I was very happy to be in the ping pong club is, for all those reasons, I think it's relatively easy for foreigners to make friends with Japanese women, young and old, because we also are somewhat on the margins and they feel an affinity with us, and also because Japanese women are much keener to make contact with the foreign world and much less threatened, I think, by the foreign world than Japanese men. So for so long I had a very bad impression of Japanese men who seem to support their families only economically, but really spend very little time with them. When I got to meet my elderly friends in the ping pong club, suddenly I saw Japanese men in their 70s and 80s when at last they were freed from their responsibilities, and they were as charming and as irresistible as little boys, and they were as engaged as grandfathers as they'd been seemingly negligent as fathers. But you've put your finger on one of the things that's almost inexplicable to us, that a Japanese husband's role traditionally has been only to provide for the family, but not to have much to do with them emotionally. The woman controls the finances and does everything to do with the family, but is, as I say, allowed almost no possibility in the public sphere. And I have two Japanese stepchildren, a son and a daughter. And archetypally, as soon as my son graduated from university, he joined Japan Airlines, he settled down in Tokyo, he married a woman, he's got a daughter, and is leading a sort of archetypal, conventional, classic Japanese life. The day my daughter graduated from university, she moved to Spain and lived there for 8 years in Spanish, essentially with her Spanish boyfriend, as I was saying, mastered English in the process too. She's come back now, but I think, as with most Japanese women, she'll always have one foot outside Japanese culture. So I couldn't be happier about your question, because it's exactly, I think, the biggest social problem in Japan. And just like you, I keep waiting. Mr. Abe talks about womenomics, and they have all these phrases about how they're going to try and incorporate women better, but it never seems to happen. And a small part of me understands that, because I think the Japanese way of thinking is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And from their point of view, they've performed a miraculous recovery since the war. Their country works very seamlessly. It's prosperous, it's efficient, it's harmonious, it's safe. Things are going fairly well on a collective level in Japan. And so I think they're much more hesitant than most countries are about changing that, about admitting people from elsewhere, or about doing anything to this smoothly running Toyota that they've constructed. But when it comes to necessary change, like the treatment of women, it's a big problem that change is not a good thing in Japan. So in my second book, A Beginner's Guide to Japan, I have a whole section about women. And also, it must be said, about some of the ways in which Japanese women see this as an opportunity. and realize, oh, if our husbands are going to have to go and spend 16 hours in the office every day, we can have fun. We can do more imaginative things with our lives. And I think many people who go to Japan will find it's the Japanese women who are the really spirited, idiosyncratic, interesting, engaged people that one meets, and who are freer in certain ways than the men who are very much entrenched within the system. But thank you for raising that point. It's a big asterisk in the story of Japan. Hand right up at the back, I think. And in front too.
Do you need to talk? Well, first, I just wanted to say I just got through reading again You're Falling Off the Map, where you made trips to all of the small, forgotten countries.
Yes.
Really enjoyed that.
Oh,
and
thank you.
I would suggest that anybody want to read that. It's really a treasure, especially Patagonia, I must say.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Patagonia is an amazing trip. You are a courageous traveler. But as far as Japan goes, I understand from somebody who's going over there a lot that the Japanese government is actually offering, there's so many empty homes that they're offering homes to people to live in free just to get people to move to Japan because so many people have left. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know anything about that. You just educated me.
Yeah.
They do famously have the problem of very, very aging population, the oldest population on the planet. And again, so far they've been rather slow about bringing in people from the neighboring countries who could work as nurses and supplement the labor force and do all kinds of things. In the lead up to the Olympics, which comes to Tokyo next July, they have been opening their gates to the rest of the world much more than before. And for me, it's quite exciting to see a huge tourist boom there. In 2003, there were 5 million international visitors to Japan. By last year, there were 31 million. So it's gone up sixfold in just a few years. Many more English language signs and announcements. Every little house in Kyoto now is an Airbnb or a guest house or whatever. And in that way, it's nice to see Japan interacting with the outside world much more than previously. But as I was just saying with regard to women, how much it's going to really change deep down, I don't know. But thank you for telling me about that system. I hadn't known about it at all. And I'm glad you enjoyed the Patagonia passages in that book, Falling Off the Map. I've only been there once, but by chance I'm going to be there again in January. So you couldn't have said a better thing.
How are the Japanese, in your view, dealing with or acknowledge, have responsibility for, or even a sense of agency about other problems in the world, specifically things like environmental degradation, climate change, and that sort of thing?
Japan is more disengaged from politics than any country that I know. Although it's technically a democracy, it's very hierarchical. And I think people feel relatively powerless, that the political leaders are just a group of lookalike guys in suits who are as remote from most people's lives as the board of General Motors would be from our lives. So I think one less happy consequence of that is there's much less concern about the environment and about larger political issues, global issues in Japan than you would find here or many places. When you began your question, I was wondering if you were going to ask about the responsibility towards the war and towards the things that Japan had done in the rest of the world. And famously, the country averts its eyes from that. There's something to be said for and against that. I was recently, just last month, in fact, in Berlin with my wife, and I've never seen her so depressed. She really, really felt heavy and weighed down by Berlin. And I said, why, of all the places we've been in 30 years? And she said, well, all the monuments are about guilt and suffering and death. And she said, well, I'm Japanese, and we feel, as the Dalai Lama was saying in the passage I read, we can't change the past. The only thing we can do is change tomorrow. So we need to concentrate on making as peaceful a tomorrow as possible and looking to what we can affect. Now, many people would say it's only by addressing the past that you can avoid making the same mistakes in the future. But Japan has a different way of dealing with things, I think, very pragmatic, again. but more than happy to avert its eyes from everything that's not so pleasant. The one thing I will say in terms of political engagement that I think is really wounding my wife and most of the Japanese people I know is that after the war, of course, Japan wrote this new constitution in which it made a commitment to peace, to being a conscientious objector among nations. And it doesn't have an army, and it said we never want to make that mistake again. And now Prime Minister Abe wants to reverse that and to set up an army. And I think people are really, really upset about that. And they feel that peace is one of the best things that Japan could preserve. So on the one hand, they're not as involved in the fates of the rest of the world as our country is, say. On the other, on the citizen level, I think they really want to keep the peace, especially at some level they remember what their grandparents went through in the war, if that begins to address your question. I know there's a gentleman up there, yes, who's getting his chance. Yes.
Yes, the American people and the Japanese people are both very interesting groups, but they're very different. And there's a lot of things we admire about them. There's a lot of things that we're puzzled about them. And there's a lot of things that we're shocked about them. How do they feel about us?
I think almost exactly the same. You phrased that so wonderfully again. When I first went to Japan, and this is the subject of the book I wrote in 1988, The Lady and the Monk, I was leaving Midtown Manhattan, and so I was drawn to Japan by the prospect of quietness, antiquity, selflessness, as you say, many of the things that we admire about Japan. And for me, it was like going to a wise elder who, for 1,400 years, had been dealing with tsunami and warfare and fire and earthquake and knew how to work with suffering and loss in a way that a younger country doesn't have that kind of experience. And my third week in Japan, I met my wife, and for some of the reasons I was just mentioning, of course, all she wanted to do was be in California, the land of possibility, the land where you could make a fresh change, the land where you weren't hostage to the pressures of a small world with everybody looking over everybody else's shoulder, and you weren't subject to the precedents of the past. You could do something that hadn't been done before. And more than by me, she was very inspired by an American woman she met there who was living as a single mother, supporting her 2 kids, working full-time, and engaged in very intensive Zen practice. And my wife looked at this lady and she thought, wait a minute, if an American woman can go and live in a foreign country, can have the courage to support her kids alone and learn about a foreign discipline, why can't I? Why can't a Japanese person? And so she was married when I met her. She walked out of her marriage with her 2 kids and thought, I want to claim an American destiny. It's wonderful to this day to see how liberating our country is for people from Japan and people from everywhere. I grew up in England, and there are many graces to England, but I was so glad when my parents moved to this country because it was like moving from a place where the horizon is this big to a place of vast horizons and with a genuine sense of opportunity that I think is almost unique in the world, which is how the US still seems to attract the brightest students from everywhere. Even as China gets so strong and Japan was getting so strong 30 years ago, I think a bright kid from Iran or Taiwan or Bangalore isn't in a hurry to go to China or Japan. They want to come to the US, maybe to Canada also. So going to Japan is a wonderful way of reminding oneself of the blessings and merits of this country. And I always enjoy seeing this country through the eyes of my wife because I've been resident here on and off for a long time and I sometimes take it for granted. And she opens my eyes to many of the better qualities here. So all in all, I'm very glad that in my lifetime, it's possible, as was not possible in my grandparents' lifetime, for many of us, especially in a room such as this, to encounter foreign cultures, which means learning from them what they have to offer and also seeing through their eyes what our culture has to offer. To me, that's one of the exciting developments that's accelerating every day as we move through this new century. Thank you for the question, and I think this will be the last one.
This is a more personal question, not about the Japanese culture, but your words, your way of reading were almost melodic to me. I appreciate so much what you read and who you are. I wonder if you write poetry.
Thank you for asking, and thank you for the compliment. I don't. Poetry really requires discipline, and it really requires a command of all these forms, and I don't quite have that. Or I don't have the discipline to learn those forms. Also, of course, it's hard to make a living as a poet. But if the prose I was reading sounded poetic to you, I'm really, really glad. And it's probably one thing I would aspire to learn from my Japanese friends and neighbors. Of course, they're masters of the haiku, something as compressed and explosive as possible. But when I moved to Japan, I was working at Time magazine prior to that, so I suppose I was writing in a very prosaic, journalistic way. And I think going to Japan has taught me how the spaces between the words are much more important than the words themselves, hence my spending 16 years taking everything out of these books. I probably had about 8,000 pages of notes when I began writing these books because I'd annotated everything that happened to me for 32 years there. And so it was a real battle to keep as much out as possible. But I thought, in deference to Japan, where they're so masterful, it's a land of subtraction, and it's a land where the fewer things you have, the more each one of those remaining things speaks. Maybe being in Japan moves one towards thinking about suggestion rather than statements, and thinking about listening rather than speaking, and therefore and teaches one about attention, as I was saying, in relation to an ashima, rather than being caught up in one's own ideas and theories. So maybe Japan brings out the poet in